My parents forgot my birthday for years, so I walked away, and they still didn't notice, and then I always knew I was the easy kid. My parents made that clear early on. Ryan, you're so independent. You don't need as much as Madison does, and I believed them. I tried to be understanding, to accept that my little sister needed more care, more attention, more love. But even easy kids need something. When I was younger, I used to dream of big birthday parties, of surprises waiting for me when I woke up. But by the time I was 8, I had already learned to lower my expectations. That year, I still held on to a little hope. I remember waking up, the morning light streaming through my window, thinking maybe, just maybe, they had planned something for me. I padded into the kitchen, still in my pajamas, expecting balloons or at least a happy birthday waiting for me. Instead, my mom was busy packing a bag, stuffing medication bottles and extra blankets into it while my dad sipped his coffee, reading over a medical bill. Morning, I chirped, waiting for some sign that today was special. Morning, honey, my mom said distractedly. Get some cereal, okay? We have to take Madison to the specialist today. I hesitated. Right, today's my... A sudden groan from the couch cut me off. Madison curled up, clutching her stomach, whimpering in pain. My mom rushed to her side, stroking her hair. My dad stood, already grabbing the car keys. I just stood there. They hurried out, my mom calling back, "We'll be back later, Ryan. Be good." And then the door slammed shut. That was the first time they forgot my birthday. It wasn't the last. Later that evening, when they finally came home, they were exhausted but cheerful. "Madison was so brave today," my dad said, ruffling her hair. "The doctor said she's improving a little." I forced a smile. "That's great." It wasn't until the next morning that my mom suddenly gasped while pouring her coffee. "Oh my God," she muttered. "Ryan, yesterday was your birthday, wasn't it?" I nodded slowly, staring at my untouched breakfast. She rushed over, squeezing my shoulders. "I'm so sorry, baby. Things have been so hectic. We'll do something later this week, okay?" Later never came. Instead, she handed me a $5 gift card, the kind they keep near the checkout lanes for last-minute shoppers. "Go get yourself something nice," she said with a tired smile. It was meant to make up for it, but all it did was confirm what I had already started to suspect. I didn't really matter. As the years passed, I got used to being the afterthought. School events, soccer games, even small things like weekend outings, I was always the one left behind. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't that they didn't love me. It was just that Madison needed them more. At least, that's what I told myself. When I was 10, I dared to hope again. Double digits felt like a big deal, something worth celebrating. I had been dropping hints for weeks, talking about the arcade downtown, mentioning how cool it would be to have a pizza party at home. My friends were all having parties, their parents making a big fuss over them, and I figured maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. But as the day drew closer, there were no whispers of secret plans. No gifts hidden around the house. No excitement. The morning of my birthday, I came downstairs, heart pounding, searching their faces for recognition. But there was nothing. Just my mom on the phone, arranging a new therapy session for Madison, and my dad already dressed for work. No happy birthday. No smile. I sat at the table, staring at my cereal while they talked about Madison's pain levels, her new medication, how they needed to adjust her schedule. I could feel the words bubbling in my throat, but I swallowed them down. What was the point? It wouldn't make them remember. It wouldn't make them care. At school, at least, my friends remembered. Chris, my best friend, grinned as he pulled out a crumpled dollar bill and some coins. "We all pitched in," he said proudly, handing me a small cup of ice cream from the cafeteria. I laughed, pretending it was enough. And maybe, for a moment, it was. But when I got home, reality settled in again. There was no surprise waiting for me. No cake. No mention of my birthday at all. My mom was too busy, my dad was working late, and Madison had been having a rough day, so everything revolved around making her comfortable. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, telling myself it didn't matter. It was just a day. The next morning, my mom finally realized. "Oh, Ryan," she sighed, guilt written all over her face. "I'm sorry. Things have just been so crazy. She promised we'd do something over the weekend. The weekend came, and Madison wasn't feeling well. Instead of a celebration, we spent the day watching her favorite movies. My dad picked up a small grocery store cake. Vanilla, not even my favorite, and set it on the counter with a quiet, "Happy late birthday, bud." I nodded, but inside, something shifted. It wasn't about the cake. It wasn't about presents. It was the realization that I was always going to come second. By the time I turned 12, I had stopped hoping altogether. I didn't drop hints. I didn't ask for anything. I woke up that morning, did my homework, played video games, and helped around the house. This time, at least, they remembered to say happy birthday. My mom gave me a quick hug. My dad clapped me on the shoulder, and that was it. No party. No special dinner. Just another day in a house where I was more of a guest than a son. I think that birthday hurt the most. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because of how painfully normal it was. It wasn't neglect out of cruelty. It was just habit. Over time, I learned to stop expecting anything. I poured myself into school, into soccer, into anything that made me feel like I existed. I spent more time at Chris's house, where his parents actually asked about my day, where I was invited to stay for dinner without being an afterthought. When I got my first A on a big test, I brought it home, excited to show my parents. My mom glanced at it, nodded approvingly, and then immediately turned back to discussing Madison's latest doctor visit. I never brought home another test again. Instead, I started waiting for the day I could leave. By the time I hit my teenage years, I had stopped expecting my parents to notice me. It wasn't that they were cruel or outright dismissive. It was just that their world revolved around Madison. And I was just the easy one, the healthy one, the kid who could fend for himself. I figured if I didn't ask for much, maybe I'd at least avoid disappointment. When I turned 13, I had a soccer game that I had been looking forward to for weeks. It was an important one, the semifinals of our district tournament. I knew my parents were busy, but I still mentioned it to them a few times, just in case. They gave me vague nods, the usual half-hearted, "We'll see," that never really meant anything. Deep down, I knew they wouldn't come, but some stupid part of me still held onto the tiniest sliver of hope. The game was incredible. I scored the winning goal in the last few minutes, and my teammates piled on top of me, cheering. The coach ruffled my hair, telling me I had talent. Parents swarmed the field, hugging their kids, taking pictures, celebrating. And me? I just stood there, glancing toward the empty bleachers. Chris's parents came over instead. "You were amazing, Ryan." His mom beamed, giving me a side hug. His dad clapped me on the back. "You should have seen yourself out there, kid. You've got a real gift." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Thanks." Chris must have noticed something in my face, because as we walked toward the locker rooms, he nudged me. "They didn't come, did they?" I shrugged. "They're busy." It wasn't a lie. When I got home, my mom was at the kitchen table, filling out insurance forms. Madison was asleep on the couch, her face pale, looking exhausted. My dad was on the phone, his voice low and serious. I stood in the doorway for a moment, waiting, wondering if I should say something. But then I saw my test from school sitting on the counter. I had gotten a 98% on my math exam, a huge deal for me. I had left it there that morning, hoping maybe someone would notice. It was still exactly where I had left it, untouched, as if it had never been there at all. I turned around and walked back to my room without a word. At 15, I started spending even more time away from home. If I wasn't at soccer practice, I was at Chris's house or wandering around town. Anywhere but home. There, I was just a shadow. It didn't matter if I was doing great in school or struggling, if I was happy or miserable. No one really saw me. My grandparents were the only ones who made me feel like I existed. Grandma Jean had this way of making even the smallest things special. Every time I visited, she'd pull out her old, stained recipe book and let me pick something to bake. "You're in charge today, Chef Ryan," she'd say with a grin, tying an apron around my waist. I didn't care about baking, not really, but I cared about those afternoons. They were mine. Grandpa Walter was quieter, but just as steady. His basement was filled with model trains, a whole miniature world he had built with his own hands. Sometimes, I'd sit with him for hours as he adjusted tiny houses and trees, making sure everything was just right. It's about the details, he'd say. The little things matter, even when people don't notice them. He didn't know how much I needed to hear that. When I was 16, things at home reached a breaking point. Madison had been having a particularly bad week, and the house felt heavier than usual. I had learned to keep my head down, to stay out of the way when things got tense. But one evening, I was in my room, playing a game. One of the few things that helped me escape for a little while. When Madison barged in, "Turn it off," she snapped. I barely glanced up. "It's not even that loud." "I don't care. I don't feel good." I sighed but kept playing. It was one of the only times I had something to myself, and I wasn't going to give it up that easily. She didn't argue. Instead, she stormed over, grabbed one of the controllers, and threw it. It smashed against the wall before clattering to the floor. I jumped up. "Are you kidding me?" She didn't even look guilty. "I told you to turn it off." My parents rushed in at the sound, their eyes immediately darting to Madison, who was now crying. "What happened?" my mom demanded. "She broke my stuff." I gestured to the controller, the now broken console on the floor. Madison wiped her tears dramatically. "I didn't mean to. I was just in pain, and he wouldn't listen to me." And just like that, I was the villain. "Ryan," my dad sighed, running a hand over his face. "Come on. She's having a rough time. You know that." "Yeah, well, so am I," I snapped. "But I guess that doesn't matter, does it?" My mom looked at me, exasperated. "Ryan, we don't have time for this." Of course they didn't. I didn't say another word. I just turned around, walked out of the room, and slammed the door behind me. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing something I had probably always known deep down. Nothing I did would ever be as important as Madison's needs. I could scream, break things, disappear for days, and they still wouldn't see me. The next morning, my mom knocked on my door, hesitant. "Ryan, we're thinking about trying family therapy. Would you be open to that?" I almost laughed. Therapy? After 16 years of being ignored? What was the point? But some tiny, desperate part of me still wanted to believe things could change. So I nodded. "Yeah, okay. Maybe, just maybe, they'd finally hear me." I started coming home later and later. At first, my parents didn't even notice. I'd stay at Chris's house after school, help him and his dad work on their car in the garage, or waste hours at the park just to kill time. Being anywhere else felt better than being home. One evening, I walked through the front door, and my mom barely looked up from the dinner table. "You need to start telling me where you are," she said absently, cutting Madison's food into small pieces. I dropped my backpack near the couch. "I'm always at Chris's. You should be home," she said. "We don't know what's going on with you lately." I almost laughed. They had spent my whole life acting like I wasn't there, and now they wanted to know where I'd been? Instead of arguing, I grabbed a plate and served myself some leftovers from the fridge. "Madison had a rough day," my dad said after a moment, rubbing his face. "Her pain's been worse. The doctor's adjusting her meds again." I nodded, already knowing what came next. The usual cycle. The exhaustion. The discussions. The concerns. They never asked how my day had been. A few nights later, I overheard my mom talking to my dad while I was in the hallway, just out of sight. "I'm worried about Ryan," she said, voice hushed. "He's just being a teenager," my dad replied. "You know how they are." "No, it's different," she insisted. "He barely speaks to us anymore. I don't know what's going on in his head." I stood there, waiting, hoping to hear something, anything, that told me they were realizing what they'd done, that they understood how much they had ignored me. Instead, my dad sighed. "Lisa, we don't have time to deal with this right now. Madison needs us. We'll talk to Ryan when things settle down." That was all I needed to hear. They didn't realize they were losing me. Worse, they didn't care enough to fix it. That night, I sat in my room, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I thought about the birthdays they had forgotten, the games they had missed, the way I had always been expected to understand, while no one had ever tried to understand me. If I didn't say something soon, nothing would ever change. The next morning, over breakfast, I put my spoon down and said, We need to talk. My parents looked up, startled. Even Madison glanced at me, confused. What is it, honey? My mom asked. I took a deep breath. I think we need therapy. Silence. Then my dad frowned. Therapy? What for? I swallowed hard. Because I feel like I don't exist in this house. My mom looked at me like I had just spoken a different language. Ryan, of course you exist. What are you talking about? You don't see me, I said, my voice steady but firm. Everything is about Madison. Every conversation, every plan, every decision. It's always her first and I just exist around it. My dad's jaw tightened. Ryan, that's not fair. You know how complicated things are. I shook my head. I'm not saying Madison doesn't need you. I'm saying I need you too. And I've been waiting my whole life for you to see that. My mom looked at me, eyes glossy. We never meant to make you feel that way. But you did, I said. And if we don't fix it now, we never will. They didn't agree right away. But later that night, my mom knocked on my door and said, okay, we'll try therapy. For the first time in years, I felt like I had been heard. But I had no idea what I was walking into. The first therapy session felt awkward from the moment we walked in. The room was small, with soft lighting and a few chairs arranged in a circle. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Harris, smiled warmly and asked us to sit. My parents looked tense, sitting close together, while Madison sat curled up in her chair like she didn't even want to be there. I sat across from them, feeling like an outsider in my own family. So, Ryan, Dr. Harris began, your parents tell me you've been feeling left out. Can you tell me more about that? I hesitated. I wasn't sure where to start. There were too many moments, too many birthdays forgotten, too many times I felt like a ghost in my own home. I just feel like I don't matter, I finally said. Like I could disappear, and nothing would change. My mom inhaled sharply. Ryan, that's not true, isn't it? I shot back. You don't even notice when I'm not there. You didn't come to a single one of my soccer games. You forgot my birthday multiple times. You don't ask about school, or my friends, or anything I do. The only time you ever really talk to me is when it's about Madison. Silence stretched between us. My dad looked down at his hands. My mom opened her mouth, but no words came out. Dr. Harris nodded. Lisa, Mark, do you see where Ryan is coming from? My mom let out a shaky breath. I do, she admitted. But it's not because we don't care. We love you, Ryan. It's just, Madison needs so much from us. And sometimes, it feels like there's no time for anything else. I clenched my jaw. That's the thing, Mom. It's always about Madison. Always. And I've spent my entire life just dealing with it. But I'm tired of feeling like I don't exist. Madison finally spoke up, her voice sharp. So what? You want me to apologize for being sick? I turned to her, anger flaring in my chest. No, Madison. I want Mom and Dad to admit that I deserve to be part of this family too. The session ended without any real resolution. My parents promised they'd try harder, that they'd make more of an effort. And for a little while, they did. We started having family nights once a week, movies, board games, even a trip to a museum. At first, it felt nice. Like maybe things could actually change. But Madison didn't like it. She started making little comments, passive-aggressive jabs about how much fun we must have had without her. It's fine, she'd say, her voice tight. I don't mind being left out. The guilt worked like a charm. One night, during dinner, she finally broke down, tears streaming down her face. You're spending less time with me, she sobbed. It feels like I'm not important anymore. My parents immediately rushed to comfort her. Oh, sweetheart, that's not true. My mom soothed. We love you so much. I don't want to be forgotten, Madison sniffled. And just like that, everything shifted. The outing stopped. The focus snapped back to Madison. I should have seen it coming. A few weeks later, in another therapy session, Madison made an accusation that knocked the air out of me. Mom and Dad love Ryan more, she said, her voice trembling. Because he's normal. I stared at her, stunned. What? My parents looked horrified. Madison, no, my dad said. That's not true at all. It feels like it, she insisted. Ever since we started trying to make Ryan happy, I feel like I don't matter anymore. I let out a hollow laugh. Are you serious? I've spent my whole life being ignored, and now, after a few weeks of getting a little bit of attention, you're acting like I've stolen everything from you. Madison wiped her tears. You wouldn't understand. The session ended in chaos. My parents were flustered, trying to reassure her, and the therapist struggled to keep things from spiraling. But I knew then that nothing was ever going to change. When we got home that night, my mom pulled me aside. Maybe we should try a different therapist, she said carefully. Someone who can help us all feel heard. I shook my head. I saw right through it. They wanted someone who would tell them what they wanted to hear. Someone who would justify why they had always put Madison first. No, I said simply. I'm done. She looked hurt. Ryan, please. I'm done trying, I repeated. It doesn't matter what I say. It doesn't matter what I do. This is never going to change. I walked away before she could say anything else. That night, I stared at my ceiling, just like I had on all those forgotten birthdays, all those lonely nights. Only this time, I wasn't hoping anymore. I was planning my escape. The night I decided to leave, I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel angry. I just felt done. I had spent years hoping, waiting for my parents to see me, to recognize that I was part of the family too. But after that last therapy session, after hearing Madison twist the situation into something it wasn't, after watching my parents scramble to comfort her while my feelings were once again brushed aside, I knew I had nothing left to give. I started planning right away. I didn't have much money, but I had saved up from a part-time job I worked after school. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. College was coming up, and while my parents had always assumed I'd go to the local university, I decided I'd apply somewhere far, somewhere they wouldn't expect me to go. A few weeks later, I got the acceptance letter. A college 3 states away had offered me a scholarship. It wasn't a full ride, but it was enough to get me started. That night, I sat at the dinner table, waiting for the right moment to tell them. Madison was talking about a new treatment plan. My mom was listening intently. My dad was nodding along. I waited for a pause, for a breath, for an opening. But there never was one. So I spoke anyway. I got into college, I said, voice steady. My mom glanced at me. That's great, honey, she said, but she was still focused on Madison. I'm moving out in August, I added. That got their attention. My dad set his fork down. Moving? Where? Out of state. Madison frowned. Why would you go that far? I shrugged. I just need a fresh start. My mom's expression tightened. Ryan, we were hoping you'd stay closer. With everything going on, we need you here. And there it was. Not we'll miss you. Not we're proud of you. Just we need you here. I pushed my chair back and stood. I'm still going. They didn't fight me on it. Not really. Maybe they assumed I'd change my mind. Maybe they thought, like everything else, I'd just let it go. But I didn't. I spent the summer packing, preparing, making sure I had everything lined up. The day before I left, I visited my grandparents. Grandma Jean hugged me tightly. I always knew you'd go somewhere big, she said. Grandpa Walter handed me a small wooden train piece, one from his collection. For when you start building your own world, he said simply. I held on to it, my throat tight. They were the only ones who had ever made me feel like I was enough. The morning I left, my mom cried. My dad clapped me on the back and told me to be careful. Madison barely looked at me. It should have hurt, but it didn't. I was too numb for that. The drive to my new life felt surreal. I watched the familiar roads disappear in the rearview mirror, waiting for some sort of sadness to hit me, some regret. But it never came. Instead, with every mile, I felt lighter. The first few weeks in the new city were quiet. I wasn't used to making my own rules, to living without the constant background noise of my family. It was strange, at first, not having to check in, not being forgotten at the dinner table because there was no dinner table. I got a job, made some friends. Chris called often, checking in on me. He was the only one from home who did. My parents called a few times in the beginning, but the conversations were brief. They'd ask how I was, but it always led back to Madison. She's been struggling lately, my mom would say. She misses you. I didn't know what to say to that. Did she miss me? Or did she just miss having me there to absorb the attention she didn't want? As the months passed, the calls became less frequent. I didn't reach out either. I was too busy figuring out who I was outside of being the forgotten son. Then, my birthday came. My first one away from them. I didn't expect much, but when the day passed with no call, no text, no acknowledgement from my family at all, I realized something. I wasn't disappointed. I wasn't hurt. I just felt free. I spent that night with my new friends, people who actually cared, people who showed up. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for anyone to remember me. I had remembered myself. The first year away from home was an adjustment, but it was the best kind of adjustment. I had spent so long feeling like an afterthought that it took time to accept that I wasn't one anymore. My life wasn't about waiting for someone to notice me. It was about deciding what I wanted and going after it. I threw myself into college, into work, into friendships that felt real. Chris and I still talked often, and he even visited once, joking that I had finally escaped my ghost status. I made new friends too, people who actually listened when I spoke, who asked how I was doing and genuinely cared about the answer. Sophia was one of them. We met in a literature class and bonded over the fact that we were both figuring out what we wanted out of life. She had a laugh that made people turn their heads, and a way of making everyone feel important. Unlike my family, she noticed the little things. If I was tired, if I was off, if I was avoiding talking about something. One day, a few months into our friendship, she called me out on it. "You deflect a lot," she said casually while we sat in a coffee shop. I raised an eyebrow. "Do I?" She smirked. "Yeah. Someone asks about you, and you turn it into a joke or change the subject. It's like you don't expect people to actually care." I shrugged, taking a sip of my drink. "Old habit, I guess." She leaned forward, serious now. "You know you're allowed to take up space, right? You don't have to shrink yourself just because other people made you feel like you weren't worth the attention." I didn't respond right away. No one had ever put it that way before. I had spent so much time accepting that I was invisible in my own family that I hadn't realized how much that mindset had followed me into my new life. That conversation stuck with me. Slowly, I let myself open up more. I started celebrating small wins, aces on tests, promotions at work, even just making it through a tough week. And when my next birthday rolled around, I didn't wait for my family to remember. I planned something for myself. It wasn't anything huge, just a night out with friends, but it was the best birthday I had ever had. We went to a bar, laughed until our sides hurt, and for once, I wasn't thinking about whether my parents would call. I wasn't checking my phone for a message that wasn't coming. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me, and I called home. My mom picked up, sounding surprised. "Ryan, it's been a while." I leaned against my desk. "Yeah, I've been busy." We made small talk for a bit, mostly about Madison, of course. Nothing had changed. She was still struggling, still the center of their world. Then, after a pause, I asked, "Did you guys even realize my birthday passed?" Silence. Then my mom let out a breath. "Oh, Ryan, I'm so sorry. Things have been so hectic." Of course they had. I didn't get angry. I didn't even feel hurt. I just nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "It's okay." Because it was. I had spent my whole life waiting for them to show up for me, and they never had. And that was never going to change. So I stopped waiting. That was the last time I called them first. If they wanted to talk, they knew where to find me. But I wasn't going to chase after people who couldn't be bothered to remember I existed. By my third year in the city, I had built a life that felt like mine. I had friends who showed up, people who actually wanted me around. I had a job I liked, plans for the future, and a version of myself that didn't revolve around waiting for scraps of attention. When my next birthday came around, I didn't even think about my family. I threw another party, bigger this time, with music and drinks and people who mattered. Sophia was there, laughing as she convinced me to do a ridiculous dance move. Chris made a toast, joking that I had finally learned how to enjoy life. It was the happiest I had ever been. A few days later, I called home again, just to see if things had changed. They hadn't. No one had remembered. And this time, I didn't even care. My parents ignored me for years. Now they're begging me to save them after their golden child failed, and then I? I'll never forget the day my parents stopped seeing me. It wasn't some dramatic argument or explosive moment. It was gradual, like watching the paint peel off a wall. Slow, quiet, and ignored until there was nothing left but emptiness. It wasn't always this way. When I was little, life felt almost normal, or as normal as it could be in a small, quiet town like Ashwood, Ohio. My parents, Steve and Karen, had 2 sons. Me, Evan Carter, the oldest at 24 now, and Ryan, my younger brother who just turned 22. The difference was that Ryan was the miracle child, the son who could do no wrong, while I was the kid who existed somewhere in the background. But back then, I didn't know the difference. I didn't understand how my quiet nature and love for things like drawing and building little projects weren't enough to hold their attention. I didn't get why they focused all their energy, love, and resources on Ryan. I just knew that slowly, bit by bit, I was becoming invisible. Ryan was the kind of kid people gravitate toward. Even as a toddler, he had that magnetic charm that made strangers smile and adults chuckle when he said something funny. By the time he hit elementary school, he was already the star. Teachers loved him. Kids wanted to be his friend. And my parents, well, they worshipped him. I, on the other hand, was quieter. I liked to read, draw, and tinker with little projects in my room. I wasn't the type to light up a room the moment I walked in, and I certainly wasn't going to charm an audience with a toothy grin like Ryan. To Steve and Karen, I was fine, just fine. I think they thought I didn't need much attention because I wasn't demanding it. At first, the favoritism was subtle. I can remember Christmas mornings when I was 6 and Ryan was 4. We'd both tear into our gifts, but his pile always seemed just a little bigger. I figured maybe it was because he was younger, so they wanted to spoil him a bit more. But as the years passed, it became obvious. Ryan wasn't just their favorite, he was everything. Birthdays were one of the clearest signs. Every year for Ryan's birthday, our house turned into a carnival. Streamers hung from every wall, balloons floated across the living room, and kids ran wild while music blasted from the speakers. Steve would man the grill outside, flipping burgers like he was cooking for a royal feast. And the gifts? A new bike, a PlayStation, a basketball hoop. Nothing was too much for Ryan. Then there were my birthdays. A grocery store cake with sloppily written icing, maybe a card, and a mumbled happy birthday, Evan, before my parents went back to talking about Ryan's soccer practice. I told myself it didn't matter. Birthdays weren't everything, right? But it still hurt. I'll never forget when I turned 12. I spent weeks begging my parents for an art set I'd seen in a store window downtown. Paints, brushes, everything. It was perfect. My mom said she'd think about it. Instead, I got a pack of pins from the dollar store. The same year, Ryan got a brand new mountain bike for his 10th birthday. He rode it up and down the street while I watched from the porch. The worst part wasn't even the gifts. It was the way my achievements never seemed to matter. I worked my butt off in middle school to get straight A's one year. I remember clutching my report card like it was gold as I ran into the kitchen, hoping, praying, that my parents would notice. I handed it to my mom. "Look, I got straight A's." She glanced at it and said, "That's nice, Evan." Then she turned back to Ryan, who was babbling about scoring 2 points in his middle school basketball game. I still remember my dad leaning back in his chair, beaming at Ryan. "You're a natural athlete, kid. 2 points. 2 lousy points," and they were acting like he'd made it into the NBA. Meanwhile, my hard work was worth a "that's nice." By high school, I stopped expecting anything. I'd come home after school, drop my backpack in my room, and bury myself in my art or whatever little projects I was working on. It was easier to disappear than to keep trying to be noticed. Ryan, of course, basked in the spotlight. He'd walk around with that smug smile on his face, like he knew he was the favorite, and he wasn't afraid to remind me of it. If I got a new pair of shoes, cheap sneakers I'd saved up for myself, Ryan would laugh and say, "Finally upgrading from the hand-me-downs?" If I tried to talk at dinner, he'd interrupt with some story about his soccer team or his plans to start his own fitness brand. What made it worse was my parents never called him out. If I ever dared to complain, they'd look at me like I was the problem. "Don't be so sensitive, Evan," my mom would say. "Ryan's just joking." But it didn't feel like a joke. One moment in particular cemented it all for me. I was 17, and I'd spent weeks working on an idea for a regional business competition. I'd sketched out designs for handmade crafts, put together a presentation, and perfected my pitch. The day I won first place, I felt like I could finally prove myself to my parents. I rushed home, holding the certificate in my hand. I couldn't stop smiling. Dad, I won first place in the business competition. He looked up from his newspaper, nodded, and said, "That's nice. Did you see Ryan's new fitness logo? Looks so professional." I stood there, staring at him, feeling like the ground had disappeared under my feet. That was the moment I knew nothing would ever change. It didn't matter what I did. I would never be Ryan. After that, I made a decision. I was done waiting for their approval. I couldn't keep living like this, feeling like I didn't matter. I started making plans to leave the moment I graduated high school. I didn't know exactly how I was going to do it, but I knew I couldn't stay. Of course, leaving wasn't going to be easy. My parents had sunk thousands into Ryan's latest business venture, some fitness gear brand that made 0 cents, and they didn't have much left for me. When I told them I wanted to move out and focus on my own small business, my dad waved me off. "Evan, we can't spread ourselves too thin. Ryan's business is the future of this family." That was the final straw. If I wanted a better life, I was going to have to build it myself. No help, no support, just me. And that's exactly what I did. I didn't leave the day after graduation with a grand plan, a perfect blueprint, or even much of a safety net. All I had was a beat-up backpack, my laptop, a few $100 saved from odd jobs, and a determination I didn't know I was capable of. I'd been invisible my whole life, but leaving that house made me feel like I was finally stepping into the light. The day I left, it was raining. Of course, it was raining. My parents didn't even notice I was packing up my things. Ryan had a soccer tournament that weekend, so Karen was too busy ironing his jersey, and Steve was loading the car with lawn chairs and coolers. I remember standing by the front door, my bag slung over my shoulder, watching them scurry around. Ryan came downstairs with his usual smug grin. "Where you headed, Evan? Gonna go write poetry in the park?" I didn't take the bait. I just looked him in the eye and said, "Good luck at your game." My dad barely acknowledged me when I stepped outside. He waved a distracted hand over his shoulder. "See you later, bud." They didn't see me drive off. They didn't see me pull onto the highway and head toward Columbus, where I'd rented a tiny studio apartment. They didn't know that I wasn't coming back. The apartment wasn't much. It was in an old building with water stains on the ceiling and carpets that smelled like stale cigarettes. But it was mine. For the first time in my life, I had a space where no one could tell me I didn't matter. I didn't waste time. I set up a makeshift office in the corner of my room. A wobbly desk I bought at a yard sale for $10 and a plastic chair that dug into my back. I didn't care. I was free. I spent every hour I wasn't at my part-time job, bagging groceries at a local market, teaching myself how to run a business. I stayed up late watching YouTube tutorials on marketing, web design, and branding. I read blog posts, forums, anything I could get my hands on. My business idea wasn't groundbreaking. Personalized products, mugs, tote bags, notebooks, stationery, things people wanted but with a personal twist. I designed everything myself, staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning hunched over my laptop. I researched niche markets, like book clubs, small weddings, and hobby communities. I wanted my products to feel special, like they were made for the buyer and no one else. The first time I made a sale, I felt like I'd won the lottery. Someone bought a mug I designed for $18. It had a cheesy slogan on it about being a proud cat owner. I stared at the notification for a long time, disbelief written all over my face. Someone out there valued something I'd created. That little sale lit a fire in me. I threw everything I had into scaling up, even when it meant making sacrifices. I skipped meals sometimes, choosing to spend money on supplies instead of food. I walked to work to save on gas. I was exhausted, my body running on cheap instant coffee and hope, but I'd never felt more alive. Meanwhile, back at home, Ryan's business was falling apart. I didn't hear about it directly, of course. My parents weren't exactly calling to give me updates, but I saw clues on social media. Ryan's team, which was just a couple of his friends who were more interested in drinking than working, had stopped posting updates. His logo, the one my parents had paid a professional designer to create, was plastered everywhere, but no one seemed to be buying. When Ryan did post, it was all vague motivational nonsense. Dream big, or hustle hard, with photos of him sitting at a desk, pretending to work. It was laughable. I knew my parents were still funneling money into his failed venture, clinging to the idea that their golden child would turn things around. By the time I turned 19, my business was starting to pick up speed. I had a small but loyal customer base, and I'd managed to save enough to move into a slightly bigger office, a single room in a low-rise building downtown. The wallpaper was peeling, and the floor creaked whenever I took a step, but it was a step up from working out of my studio. Every day, I sat at my desk surrounded by boxes of mugs, tote bags, and planners, hustling harder than I ever thought possible. I handled every order myself: design, printing, packing, shipping. Some nights, I'd collapse into my chair, my hands covered in ink or tape, and stare at the ceiling, wondering if I could keep this up. But I always pushed forward. Then, out of the blue, my parents called. It had been months since I'd spoken to them, months of blissful silence. I was in the middle of packing an order when my phone buzzed. "Hello? Evan," my dad said, his voice overly cheery. "How's life treating you?" I knew right then they wanted something. My parents didn't call unless they needed a favor. I leaned back in my chair and waited for the other shoe to drop. "Well," Steve continued after a pause, "Ryan's got a new business idea. Something really exciting. We're putting together a little family meeting to brainstorm, and we thought you could come home and, lend a hand." There it was. They didn't care how I was doing. They didn't care that I'd been working my ass off to build something out of nothing. All they cared about was Ryan. Why would I do that? I asked calmly, though my blood was boiling. "Because family sticks together, Evan," my dad replied like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Ryan's learned a lot since his last venture didn't pan out, and we all just want to support him. You could really help get him back on his feet." I let out a short laugh. "Why would I help Ryan? You've never once asked me if I needed help with anything." "Evan," my dad sighed, like I was being unreasonable, "we've always been there for you." "No, you haven't," I cut him off. "Don't pretend you have. Ryan's your world, and you know it." I expected him to argue, but there was a long silence. Then he said, "If you don't come back, we'll stop supporting you financially." That made me laugh even harder. "Dad, I haven't needed your money in a long time. I'm doing just fine on my own." Another pause. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I built my own business while you were busy throwing everything you had at Ryan. And guess what? It's working." I could practically hear the disbelief through the phone. "You're joking." "I'm not," I said bluntly. "I don't need you anymore." "I haven't for a while." He hung up on me after that. I put my phone down, took a deep breath, and let myself feel it. The weight of years of rejection lifting off my shoulders. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need them at all. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. After that phone call, I thought my parents would leave me alone. I figured Steve and Karen would be too stunned to process the fact that I was doing fine, better than fine, without them. But I was wrong. If anything, my revelation stirred something in them. Like the idea of me thriving outside of their reach was somehow offensive. For a while, though, the silence was blissful. I threw myself into my business harder than ever. Orders kept flowing in, and I started introducing new product lines. I expanded into custom planners and journals, things people could personalize for themselves or as gifts. Wedding favors, corporate gifts, quirky book club bundles, you name it, I designed it. I spent my days working out of my little office, surrounded by boxes and half-finished mock-ups. I'd upgraded my $10 yard sale desk to something sturdier, though I still sat on the same cheap chair because comfort wasn't a priority. I had a small coffee maker in the corner that never got a break and a corkboard covered with sticky notes for my ideas. My life was chaos, but it was my chaos, and I loved it. As the months went by, my business grew faster than I expected. I'd built a loyal customer base online, and word of mouth started bringing in even bigger orders. A local boutique shop in Cincinnati reached out, asking if I could stock their shelves with a line of exclusive notebooks and tote bags. When I signed that contract, I sat back in my chair and grinned at the ceiling. Me, the invisible son, the forgotten kid. making real deals and earning real money. Meanwhile, Ryan's business continued its slow-motion collapse. I didn't hear much directly from my parents, but sometimes I'd catch wind of things through people back home. Ryan's fitness gear brand had completely tanked. My parents had rented him an office in downtown Ashwood, poured money into branding, and even paid for an expert consultant who, from what I could tell, was just Ryan's buddy with a LinkedIn profile. None of it mattered. One of my high school friends, Nate, sent me a photo he'd snapped on his phone one day. It was of Ryan's office. The windows were dusty, the lights were off, and a hand-scrawled sign reading, "Back soon," had been taped to the door for weeks. "Golden boy isn't looking so golden anymore," Nate texted. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel some grim satisfaction seeing it. After years of being cast aside, after all the sacrifices my parents made for Ryan, here I was building something real while their star was burning out. But my parents? They still weren't ready to face reality. About 2 months after that disastrous phone call with my dad, my mom called me. I was elbow-deep in packing orders, the smell of cardboard and ink filling the room, when my phone started buzzing on the desk. I glanced at the caller ID. Mom. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, considering whether to ignore it. Against my better judgment, I picked up. "Hello? Evan. It's Mom. Oh, it's so good to hear your voice." Her tone was overly sweet, the kind she used when she wanted something. I leaned against my desk, already bracing myself. "What do you need, Mom?" She hesitated, and for a second, I could hear the fake smile falter. "It's not about needing anything, sweetheart. Your father and I were just talking, and we realized we haven't heard from you in so long. We're worried." Worried? Now they were worried? I kept my voice even. "I'm fine. Busy with work." "That's good to hear," she said quickly, latching onto the thread of conversation. "Speaking of work, well, your father and I have been thinking a lot about Ryan. He's had such a hard time lately, and we just want to see him get back on track. Here it comes. We were hoping you could talk to him," she continued. "Maybe give him some advice? You've clearly done so well for yourself. Maybe you could help him figure out what he's doing wrong." I laughed, a short, bitter sound that caught her off guard. "You're serious? After everything?" "Evan," she said, her voice edging into that exasperated tone I knew so well, "this isn't about the past. It's about family. Ryan looks up to you." "No, he doesn't," I interrupted. "He never has. And you don't care about my success, Mom. You just want me to bail him out because you're running out of ways to prop him up. That's not fair," she said, her voice sharp. "We care about you, Evan. We've always cared about you." For years, I dreamed of hearing her say something like that. But now, it didn't mean anything. "You know what's not fair, Mom?" I said, my voice steady but cold. "Spending your entire life treating one son like a trophy and the other like a burden. And now that Ryan's failing, suddenly you want me to step in and save him?" "No." I heard her take a shaky breath. "We just want to fix this, Evan. We're still a family." I shook my head even though she couldn't see it. "No, Mom. You and Dad only want me around when it's convenient for you. I don't owe you or Ryan anything. Not anymore." The line was quiet for a long moment. Then she said softly, "I don't know why you're being so cold to us." I didn't bother responding. I hung up and tossed the phone onto my desk, breathing hard. For the next few weeks, the calls kept coming. Steve left angry voicemails about how ungrateful I was, accusing me of abandoning the family. Karen sent long, rambling texts about forgiveness and family values. I ignored them all. But then Ryan showed up. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and I was in the middle of sorting through inventory when my receptionist, a college intern I'd hired, poked her head into my office. Evan? There's a guy here asking for you. Says he's your brother." My stomach sank, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Send him in." Ryan walked into my office looking like a shadow of the smug kid I used to know. His hair was messy, his eyes tired, and he wore clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in a while. He didn't sit. He just stood there, hands shoved into his pockets. "Evan," he said, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Can we talk?" I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "What do you want, Ryan?" He looked at the floor. "I messed up. I know I messed up. Mom and Dad, they're angry. At me. At everything. They keep saying I ruined everything, and I don't know what to do. I raised an eyebrow. And you think I can fix that? He looked up at me, desperation in his eyes. I need someone to have my back. I stared at him. All the years of torment, smug remarks, and favoritism flooding back. I remembered the times he laughed at me, the times he rubbed in how much better he was treated. And now here he was, asking for my help. You want me to have your back? I said slowly. Where were you when I needed someone to have mine? Ryan flinched like I'd slapped him. He didn't answer. I shook my head. You made your choices, Ryan. You let Mom and Dad spoil you while they ignored me. Now you're dealing with the consequences. That's not my problem. He stood there for a moment, silent. Then he turned and walked out the door without another word. As the door clicked shut, I let out a long breath. For the first time in my life, I realized I didn't feel small anymore. I didn't feel like the forgotten kid hiding in the shadows. I was in control now. A week after Ryan's surprise visit, I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd finally get the message. I'd made it clear I wasn't their backup plan, their fixer, or their safety net. I was done being treated like the invisible son who suddenly became useful when their golden child fell apart. But, of course, they couldn't let it go. It started small. Random calls I ignored. My dad leaving vague voicemails about family emergencies and coming together in tough times. Karen texting me things like, Evan, please call us. We need you. I deleted the messages without reading them all the way through. Then it escalated. One afternoon, I was deep in work, going through designs for a big wedding favor order, when the door to my office flew open. I looked up, startled, as my receptionist, Tina, stumbled in, her face pale. Evan, there's a woman here. She says she's your mom. She wouldn't take no for an answer. I froze. She's here. Before Tina could answer, Karen Carter pushed her way in. My mother. In my office. Standing there like she had every right to be there, holding her purse in front of her like a shield. Evan, she said breathlessly, as if her life depended on getting through the door. We need to talk. I sighed and leaned back in my chair, trying to steady my voice. You can't just show up here, Mom. This is my workplace. She glanced around the room, her eyes darting to the shelves lined with boxes, stacks of inventory, and my computer with open design files. Her expression flickered between surprise and discomfort, like she couldn't believe I'd built something real. This is nice, she said weakly. I ignored the attempt at small talk. What are you doing here? Karen exhaled shakily and stepped closer. Evan, we can't keep ignoring this. Your father and we're in trouble. Things have gotten bad. Really bad. I didn't say anything. I just waited, arms crossed, as she squirmed under my silence. Ryan's business failed, she admitted finally, like it was some big revelation. We invested everything we had. We thought he'd turn things around. But it didn't work. The house is gone. That caught me off guard. Gone? Her eyes were wet now, her voice trembling. We couldn't keep up with the mortgage after everything we put into Ryan. We had to sell it. We're living in a small apartment now, barely enough space to move. I should have felt something. Sadness, sympathy, anger, but all I felt was numb. I thought back to the house I grew up in, where Ryan had been treated like a prince while I was ignored like a piece of old furniture. Now it was gone, just like their illusions of Ryan's greatness. So that's why you're here, I said flatly. You want my help? Her face crumpled. We don't have anyone else to turn to. Your father's lawsuit. He's being sued by one of his old clients for breach of contract. It's more than we can handle. And Ryan? I asked. What's he doing to help? Karen hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. Ryan left. I blinked. He what? He moved 2 states over, she said quietly. He's staying with a friend. He won't answer our calls. That hit me harder than I expected. All those years of being propped up, spoiled, and praised. And Ryan abandoned them the moment things got hard. Meanwhile, they'd spent my entire life acting like I wasn't worth their time. And now they wanted me to clean up the mess he left behind. Let me get this straight, I said, leaning forward. You spent years bending over backward for Ryan. You gave him everything, your time, your money, your love. And now that he's bailed on you, you're coming to me because you have no one else left." Karen flinched, and for a second, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Maybe guilt, maybe shame. "It's not like that, Evan." "Then what is it?" I shot back, my voice rising. "Because that's exactly what it looks like." She took a shaky step toward my desk. "We made mistakes, Evan. I know we did. We were so focused on helping Ryan succeed that we lost sight of everything else. Of you. I know we hurt you, and I'm so sorry. But please, we're asking you for help. Just this once." I looked at her, standing there in my office, begging for scraps of mercy like I hadn't been doing the same thing my entire childhood. I should have felt victorious, seeing her there, so broken and desperate. But all I felt was tired. "What kind of help do you want?" I asked carefully. Her shoulders sagged with relief. "We just need enough to get back on our feet. Help us figure out our finances, pay down some of the bills. Give us a chance to start over." I shook my head. "You don't get it, do you? I worked for everything I have. Every single dollar. I sacrificed sleep, food, time. While you were busy throwing money at Ryan's ridiculous dreams. And now you're asking me to save you?" Tears ran down her face, but I couldn't stop. "Do you even realize what you did to me? All those years I spent begging for a shred of your attention, your approval. Watching you treat Ryan like he was a king while I got whatever scraps you had left. And now you're here because you don't have a choice." She sniffled, trying to steady herself. "We want to fix things, Evan. We can't change the past, but we can start over. As a family." "Family," I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. "You don't get to say that. You didn't care about me when it mattered. You only care now because you're out of options." "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. I stared at her for a long time, my chest tight, my fists clenched under the desk. A part of me wanted to throw her out of my office and slam the door behind her. Another part of me, some quiet, stubborn part, felt the weight of her words, the years of neglect, the hollow ache of wanting something I'd never get. Finally, I exhaled. "I'm not giving you money, Mom. I won't bail you out. But I'll think about something. I don't know what yet." Her eyes lit up, like even that small crack in the door was enough to give her hope. "Thank you, Evan. Thank you." "Don't thank me," I said sharply. "You haven't earned it." She left soon after, leaving the faint smell of her floral perfume lingering in the room. I sat there for a long time, staring at the door, trying to process what had just happened. For years, I'd been invisible to them. Now they were looking at me not as a son, but as a last-ditch lifeline. I didn't know what I was going to do. Part of me wanted to walk away and let them deal with the consequences of their choices. Another part of me, the one I'd spent years burying, still felt tied to them, no matter how much I wanted to pretend otherwise. One thing was clear, though. Whatever I chose to do next, it would be on my terms. I thought my mother's unannounced visit was the peak of the drama. I should have known better. When my family falls, they don't just stumble. They drag everyone down with them. It wasn't long before my dad decided to take his own shot at wearing me down. A few days after my mother stormed into my office, I got another call. This time, the number on my phone was unfamiliar, but I answered out of habit. "Evan," the voice growled. "It's your father." I rolled my eyes. He didn't even bother with a hello. Straight to business. "What do you want, Dad?" I asked, bracing for whatever nonsense was about to hit me. There was no warmth in his voice, just the sharp edge of frustration. "We need to talk. Face to face. Your mother said you refused to help her." "That's because I did refuse," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "I'm not going to bail you out. I already told her that." He scoffed like I'd insulted him. "You'd let your own family fall apart? After everything we've done for you?" I couldn't help but laugh at the audacity. "Everything you've done for me? Like ignoring me for 20 years? Like pouring every dime you had into Ryan while I worked for everything I own? Tell me, Dad, what exactly have you done for me?" "That's not the point," he snapped. "We're your parents, Evan. We raised you. We deserve your respect, if nothing else." My patience snapped. "You don't get to demand respect. Respect is earned. And you both lost mine a long time ago." There was a long pause on the line. The kind of silence that said more than words ever could. Finally, he sighed, his voice lower this time. We're out of options, Evan. Your mother is barely holding it together. We've lost everything. The house, the business connections. Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to have nothing after working your whole life? Maybe you should have thought about that before you handed Ryan everything on a silver platter. I shot back. You made your choices. Now you get to live with them. For once, my dad didn't have a snappy comeback. Instead, his voice softened, something I hadn't heard in years. We were wrong. About Ryan. About everything. But we don't know how to fix it without you, Evan. You're the only one doing well. You're the only one who made something of yourself. The words should have meant something, but they felt hollow. I'd spent years waiting for them to notice me, to say you matter, Evan. But now that they were saying it, it was too late. They didn't care about me. They cared about what I could do for them. I'm sorry you're struggling, I said finally, but I'm not your safety net. I hung up before he could reply. My hand shook as I set the phone down on my desk, and I let out a long breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. For the next few days, I felt like I was walking around with a storm cloud above my head. I couldn't focus. Every time I tried to work, my parents' voices echoed in my mind. My mother's pleading tone, my father's frustration. I kept replaying every moment of my childhood. The missed birthdays, the shrugged-off accomplishments, the endless praise for Ryan. The guilt tried to creep in, and I hated it. Part of me still wanted to help them, as ridiculous as that sounded. Not because they deserved it, but because I wasn't like them. I wasn't cruel or dismissive. No matter how much I told myself I didn't care anymore, the truth was, I did. Then, Ryan showed up again. It was late in the afternoon, and I was just locking up for the day when I saw him leaning against the wall outside my office building. He looked worse than the last time I'd seen him. His hair unkempt, his clothes wrinkled, and his face pale. Ryan, I said flatly, pulling the keys from the lock. What are you doing here? He straightened up, shoving his hands into his pockets. I need to talk to you. We've already talked. Please, Evan, he said, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. Just 5 minutes. I sighed and crossed my arms, staying where I was. Fine.
Talk.
He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. Mom and Dad are losing it. I didn't mean for it to get this bad. I thought I could make something work. I wanted to make them proud. I snorted. Congratulations. You failed. Just like they failed me. He flinched, but I didn't let up. You had everything handed to you, Ryan. Everything. And you blew it. Meanwhile, I had to claw my way out of the hole you and Mom and Dad dug for me. So don't stand there and tell me you didn't mean for it to happen. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I know I was a jerk to you. I don't know why I acted like that. I guess I liked being the favorite. I didn't realize how much it hurt you until now. I studied him for a moment. For once, Ryan wasn't smug or arrogant. He looked small, weak, human. Too little, too late, I said finally. I don't need your apology, Ryan. I moved on. He nodded, swallowing hard. I get it. I just thought you should know that I really am sorry. I didn't say anything. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there alone. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the ceiling. I kept thinking about Ryan's words, about my father's bitter admission that I was the only one who'd made something of myself. I should have felt triumphant. For years, I dreamed of this moment, the day they'd see me for what I was worth. But instead, I felt empty. All the years of neglect and dismissal had left scars too deep to fix. A week later, I got a call from my Aunt Mary, the only extended family member I still talk to. Evan, she said cautiously, I don't know if you've heard, but your parents are in real trouble. The lawsuit's getting worse, and they might lose everything. I figured, I said, trying not to sound too indifferent. She hesitated. I know they treated you badly. I know you don't owe them anything. But they're your parents, Evan. Are you really just going to let them hit rock bottom? I stayed quiet for a moment, my jaw tight. I don't know, Aunt Mary. She sighed. Just think about it. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But sometimes being the bigger person is about doing what feels right, not what they deserve. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment for a long time. I thought about everything. The years of being overlooked, the endless praise Ryan got, the sacrifices I made to get where I was now. My parents had done this to themselves. They made their choices, and they were paying for them. But Aunt Mary's words stuck with me. Being the bigger person doesn't mean they deserve it. It means I deserve to let go of this weight. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but for the first time, I realized that whatever I chose, it wasn't about them. It was about me, and I was finally the one in control.